It's time for Supply Chain Now. Broadcasting live from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia. Heard around the world, Supply Chain Now spotlights the best in all things supply chain. The people, the technologies, the best practices, and the critical issues of the day. And now, here are your hosts.
Hey, good afternoon. Scott Luton here with you on Supply Chain Now. Welcome back to the show. On today's episode, we're speaking with an industry leader that helps focus investors, companies, and cities on taking urgent action to build a truly sustainable economy by measuring and understanding their environmental impact. This interview is part of our continuing collaboration with the Automotive Industry Action Group, so stay tuned as we look to increase your supply chain IQ. Quick programming note before we get started here. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. Want to welcome in my fearless co-host on today's show once again, Mr. Greg White, serial supply chain tech entrepreneur and trusted advisor. Greg, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Scott. How are you?
Doing fantastic. We've got a great guest here today.
I thought I'd interview you one.
This will continue a string of really interesting interviews that have been associated with the upcoming summit that that AIAG is putting on. So looking forward to this one.
Yeah, we've met with some really interesting folks. And, you know, this is maybe that not everybody knows, but you and I know this is a topic of real passion for you and I in terms of corporate responsibility, sustainability, ethical business practice, all of that sort of thing. So it's, you know, it's been interesting to talk to a bunch of people who are focused on this.
Absolutely. Well, not only is it interesting to me and you, but consumers are demanding it more and more, right? In terms of how companies operate and decisions they make and what they support and their messaging. So let's welcome in our featured guest here today, Bruno Sarda, President at CDP North America. Bruno, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate your time and your thought leadership and looking forward to learning a lot more. Greg, before we dive into CDP, let's kind of get a sense of who Bruno is. So Bruno, tell us about yourself, including, say, you know, where you're from and maybe walk us through your professional journey, especially any positions that helped shape your worldview.
Sure. Well, let's see. I'm actually a native of Paris, France. That's where I originally grew up.
Okay.
And then moved to the States in my late teens. Actually came to the U.S. for university. Ended up marrying and staying here. I've lived on both coasts. Currently live on the East Coast. I've lived on the West Coast. I've lived in the middle as well in places like Austin, Texas, and Phoenix, Arizona. It's been an interesting journey. And then you know, professionally, I've had an interesting opportunity to be kind of at the start of two significant kind of societal movements. The first 15 years or so of my career were kind of forged in the crucible of the internet and the early days of digital disruption. You know, from the mid-90s for about 15 years, you know, kind of rode that kind of crazy wave of how the internet really kind of plowed through society, the economy, business, consumer practices, and really changed everything in its wake. And at the time worked for, you know, originally for Charles Schwab, you know, as it was trying to figure out in the financial services sector how the internet should be viewed, how it was or wasn't going to change business. And Schwab was, I think, very prescient in realizing this thing's going to be big. And it's not whether or not we want it to happen, it's how we deal with it. And so that really helped me learn early on the importance of how do you take these big kind of outside external disruptors and turn them into an innovation platform, turn them into an opportunity pathway. And so I did that for a long time at Schwab. I then moved on in the tech sector, worked for Dell for 11 years, where again I led part of Dell's kind of e-commerce strategy and platform. And then actually pivoted then about 10 years ago into corporate sustainability. So as you know, not that the internet is ever truly a mature platform. But this idea that, you know, things like climate change, like water scarcity, like, you know, circular economy and other things were starting to be, you know, big enough on the horizon that it was clear that it was going to impact business. It was going to impact actually a lot of things, similar to the way the internet did. And so I kind of took everything that I learned, if you will, in kind of managing and riding this wave of digital disruption to do the same with sustainability. You know, things like climate change. It's not how you feel about it, or, you know, it's really how you help your organization prepare to ride that wave and turn it into a way to competitive differentiation, to market innovation, and ultimately to, you know, to meeting or shaping customer demand.
Okay, well, you're reading my mind, because what I wanted to ask you is what successful companies get right when presented with these huge movements. But you already, on the tail end of your answer, you kind of spoke to that a bit. Anything else come to mind? I mean, clearly some of the big names you've worked for and some of what you're seeing out in the industry. You know, the internet did change everything, and circularity thinking may do just that and much more here in the years ahead. How do you view successful, anything else you want to add to your answer in terms of how successful organizations really get it right given these movements?
You know, I think there's several lessons, and one that I learned is I think you have to approach all of these with a right balance of, you know, willingness to take risks and deal with ambiguity, you know, make decisions in the face of uncertainty and incomplete answers, but also with a lot of humility and being, you know, truly trying to always be the student and not the teacher. And in fact, so much so that I ended up actually reconnecting with academic institutions in my path early in my sustainability journey, so much so that I've now become, actually I'm a professor of practice, a faculty member at Arizona State University in their School of Sustainability, actually teaching sustainability leadership to executives, partly because, you know, the saying, right, if you really want to learn something, you learn like 10% of what you read, so whatever of what you do, and then you retain much more of what you teach. And so I think that the lesson there is just be hungry for knowledge. I think be open to outside ideas, including conflicting ideas. You know, you always learn something from somebody who disagrees with you, and approach it with an open mind.
Love that. We need a lot more of that type of approach in modern society. We'd all be so much better off. Hey, Greg, I want to bring you in because we're going to talk about CDP momentarily, but you and Bruno have something in common in that y'all both spent some time in Phoenix, Arizona, right?
We may have, yes. In fact, my wife is from Tempe.
Oh, great.
And I have spent many a day, maybe too many nights on Mill Avenue.
I know it well.
Sure. And of course, we're big fans of Arizona State, and in particular their supply chain and business programs there.
Yeah.
We interviewed Hitendra Chaturvedi about 2 weeks ago, and wow, what an incredible talent there. I mean, there's just so much knowledge in that organization.
Yeah,
so
totally agree.
With that, so you're currently a part-time adjunct professor at ASU, Bruno, is that right?
Professor of practice, yeah.
Okay.
And I work quite a bit also with some of the faculty in their supply chain program. Years and years ago, I was actually co-chair of one of the working groups of the Sustainability Consortium, which was also closely connected to their supply chain management program.
Okay, man, blessed be the ties that bind. So, Greg, let's talk about CDP.
Yeah, so let's take you a little bit away from Phoenix and give us an idea of what CDP does. We put a little bit of research into it, but for our listeners, give us an idea of what CDP does and the role you play.
Sure. Well, you know, the name stands for, the original name of the organization was the Carbon Disclosure Project, and then as we expanded beyond just kind of a focus on carbon, then the name CDP stuck, because frankly everybody who worked with CDP called it CDP and not the Carbon Disclosure Project, but it's certainly not a household name. But CDP is actually turning 20 this year. It was created 20 years ago actually with a relatively simple idea to create a systemic link between environmental information and financial information. At the time, we were working with some investors really at the vanguard of trying to understand how emerging environmental issues, specifically climate change, would impact portfolios and portfolio returns and market returns over time. And like all investors, they wanted data, and there was none, because frankly this information wasn't out there. You had scientists and academics studying the topic, but frankly business and finance was not at the table. And so CDP was created basically to request information originally from companies, then later it evolved to cities as well. Started back then with working with 35 investors and requesting information from a couple hundred companies. Right now, our investor signatories, it's about 530. They manage over $100 trillion in assets. That's with a T. And then on their behalf, we collected information from nearly 8,500 companies last year who collectively account for more than 50% of global market cap in 100 different countries, along with disclosures from nearly 1,000 cities and regions where nearly about 1 billion people live. And so what that allows us to do is we have basically this unique information capture system on climate change, on water security, and on commodity-driven deforestation, specifically on 4 commodities of soy, palm oil, timber, and cattle. And so we're able to feed basically all of the data ecosystems, both in banks and in investors and equity, but also a lot of environmental nonprofits, think tanks, and frankly even policymakers to help them understand, how is business and how are subnational entities preparing for some of these shocks, innovating in the face of some of these disruptive external changes, and we are, in a way, if you will, the scorekeepers, the scorecard of how business and finance are interfacing on these topics.
So this started as a service to investors, it seems, to assess the kind of exposures in the future that companies they might invest in or have invested in might have that could be costly, either from an operational or a brand identity or some other aspect of the business. But it seems like it's evolved into a more active role than that. Is that a fair estimation?
Yeah, that's a great insight. When we set out exactly to collect information to help investors have this information, but what we found is actually they were really asking us to help them figure out, so what does this mean? So, our little tagline at CDP is disclosure, insight, action, because ultimately none of this matters if it doesn't lead to change and to specific actions. And so the disclosure, the collection of information, if you will, is the bulk of the work. But then, it leads to a very specific set of insights. Again, some of them are sector-specific, region-specific, market-specific, and then those insights then lead to action. And then we're also actively engaged. For example, we're kind of the tip of the spear of this organization or this effort called the Science-Based Target Initiative. We now have about 850 large companies that have set or committed to set a science-based target to address climate change in line with basically accepted climate science and the Paris Accord, same on other areas of their environmental footprint. So we're engaged in actually helping businesses really drive action, and this is what led to, frankly, the creation of CDP's supply chain program. Is about 12, 13 years ago, Walmart actually are the ones who said, hey, that thing you keep asking us, can we do that to our suppliers, because we would love to basically see that level of information from our suppliers to help us understand where we potentially have unmanaged climate risks or untapped opportunities in our supply chain. And you know, what began at the time with just one, mind you, very large company, but one company, now we work with about 130 large multinationals, including quite a few in the automotive sector, to collect information from thousands and thousands of companies across their supply chains, many of which are actually not publicly traded. So this goes beyond, if you will, our investor requests to create visibility, not just for investors, but also for companies.
Yeah, I noticed that, I mean, you have a lot of potential constituencies there, right? States and cities and companies and, you know, and other governments and that sort of thing. And this is a really, really common initiative, and it's funny, doesn't seem like it's been 20 years, I'm sure, but it has been over the last 20 years. Something that, as Scott said earlier, consumers, buyers, right, the ultimate customer is more and more aware of and making decisions based on. And it has really necessitated if Walmart wants to be accountable to their consumers, they need to know where their goods are coming from and whether they are being produced or sourced or distributed sustainably. So is it the case that you surface this information only, or is it ever the case that you help companies? I guess, you know, maybe I should cut to the broader question, which is, you know, what are the big problems that you're helping customers solve? I think you've described that, but I'm curious specifically around whether you help them not only understand what those issues are, but maybe even help them solve them or point them the right direction. Because it seems like you would accumulate the knowledge of how to mitigate some of these risks simply by data.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. You know, we are a nonprofit. You know, we're not a consultancy, we're not a solution provider, and we're careful to, you know, to kind of retain, if you will, our autonomy in that sense, especially because, as I mentioned earlier, we're the kind of the scorekeepers. Actually, we do assign scores, and so every year companies get graded by CDP, and the good news is actually that those grades tend to be good leading indicators. For example, for the last 7 straight years, companies that get an A from CDP have outperformed their peers in the stock market by about an average of 5.5% a year. So, you know, that's the kind of information that investors have been looking for. And so, you know, the other thing we do that we feel is really important is we pitch a really big tent, you know, and I mentioned earlier, we work with investors who manage over $100 trillion in assets. You know, if you look at some of the other initiatives that are pushing environmental agendas or things like that, and they say, oh, you know, we work on behalf of investors maybe managing, you know, 10 or 15 or $20 trillion, still a lot of money, mind you. But, you know, the reason we have by far such a much larger group of investor signatories is because, you know, we're not out there pushing a particular program, agenda, policy. What we do is we work with companies anywhere they are in the journey. They could literally be at ground zero and having done nothing, but realizing that, okay, now's the time to start. And we know how to help them from how to build basically data collection mechanisms. So what do you go measure? How do you go measure it? How do you start accounting for this stuff? How do you start disclosing it? So, you know, every year we have new companies who are disclosing for the first time. You know, last year we had just in China, 750 companies disclosing to CDP, many for the first time, and other parts of kind of emerging markets. And so, you know, where there's no regulation anywhere. You know, I mentioned earlier, nearly 8,500 companies in over 100 countries. There's not a single one anywhere where it's required by law or any sort of regulation that they disclose at the level that CDP requests. So 100% of these disclosures are voluntary. So as a result, you know, we really try to create a value proposition for the organization and their stakeholders of why do it. So yeah, for sure, we help them along this path. They have to obviously want to be part of the process and move along, but whether they're at the very far end of kind of sophistication, and you see some of these companies out there, maybe a Walmart, maybe a Microsoft, maybe a Unilever, really that have been at this for 10, 15, 20 years. And then you have the ones that are like literally starting and asking, so where do I start? And so we try to make it possible for any organization to go from where they are to a place of improvement at their own pace. And we have both capabilities ourselves, but then we bring a lot of partners. And whether it's the Science-Based Target Initiative that I mentioned, it's the RE100 for organizations that are trying to source more renewable energy for their businesses, and a variety of then an ecosystem of partners who are then more specifically able to help companies with whatever their needs are.
So let's shift gears a bit and let's kind of broaden the discussion, although we've kind of been kind of broad, I think, through the first half of this interview. When you survey the global end-to-end supply chain community, clearly a ton of uncertainty, a tough time for many organizations and many professionals, and no shortage of tough decisions in this pandemic environment. But what one or two developments or challenges or topics really stick out that you're tracking more than others right now, Bruno?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly no shortages, and as you know, I mean, climate change is actually happening now. Not just, it's not I mean, it'll be worse in the future if we don't address it, but it's already happening. It's already a global issue, and in order to address it, urgent action at an unprecedented scale is needed. And I think, with coronavirus, and same as climate change, I think we know that the best time for action is long before the problem becomes severe. And, sometimes it feels like it's an expensive proposition, but certainly spending billions to prevent a problem is better than spending trillions to address a problem once it's kind of at your doorstep. So, we truly look at, so what are the systemic levers to kind of where you get the most bang for your buck in terms of, and, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, we certainly believe in the role of government and sound policy, but it's not really what we do. We believe in many ways that the time for policy as the main lever for change has passed, and that, that the kind of change that we need now needs to happen at the speed and scale of business. And as a result, we look to the world's business community as the strongest force for change, because when business wants to start pivoting, and again, we saw this with the internet, we saw this with wireless, we saw it with, so many different things, that when the business, wants to change, it knows how to do this fast and at scale. And so our, generally speaking, our focus is on, working with companies, and then over time, we've helped companies see that, in fact, one of their biggest levers is actually, in fact, in their supply chains, because for a long time, it was about, have you changed the light bulbs, and
Right.
have you, put insulation in the walls, and then, where do you buy your power, and all of those things matter. But for most companies, especially large multinationals, their supply chain footprint could be 5, 7, 10x their operational footprint,
Sure.
as well as their risk. And I think we're seeing that in real time. And so as I think about some of these biggest trends, here we are in 2020. We're 20 years old, but we know that for all that we've achieved in the last 20 years, we need to achieve way more than we have in the last 20 in the next 10. And the countdown has begun. So certainly some key trends we're looking at as, where are the biggest opportunities, where the biggest bang, certainly as we're here, also thinking of the auto industry, which for many good reasons, the focus for them for their climate risks and impacts has been on the downstream part of their value chain, emissions from vehicles they've built. The fact is, there's plenty for them to worry about and to focus on as opportunities in their upstream emissions. For example, the auto industry purchases, 40% of the world's steel, and steel industry generates 7 to 9% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So the production of steel produces about as much greenhouse gas emissions as basically, passenger vehicles do in the world. And so, really trying to look at these trends and helping industry players. What's exciting about the auto industry specifically is that it's a relatively small group. It's 40% of the world's steel, but when you look at the remaining 60%, it's like tens of thousands of buyers. It's construction companies, it's all kinds of things. But that 40% of the steel is bought by a relatively small number of automotive companies. For us is something we're very, very focused on as a key lever for change, for example.
One of the things that my mind went to as you shared a lot of what your perspective there is, there's the industry, the supply chain industry for years now has been after more and more visibility, right? And when I think of CDP, it may not be completely accurate, but you're in the visibility business, right? Collecting a ton of information. And I think to your point about change that needs to take place at the speed and scale of business, I think once more organizations and once more leaders have more of have more visibility in general, but also more of the right, correct, and relevant information through some of these transportation initiatives, I'm really excited about where the industry can go, and not just to tackle some of these huge challenges such as taking much bigger strides from a sustainability standpoint, from an ethicality standpoint, from for that matter, taking on a lot of lessons that will be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. So any initial thoughts to visibility or the huge need for correct, accurate, and timely information exchange?
Yeah, no, as you point out, that's very much, why we show up to work every day, even if these days showing up to work is, going to the living room or to the home office. But that's exactly right. Just to make this real. I mean, for example, I just mentioned this steel example. Our CDP supply chain program works again with 10 major auto companies. Last year these requested, the 18 largest steel suppliers in the world to measure and disclose their environmental footprint, and 15 of them actually complied with that request. There's always a bit of a lag. Not every company, again, is at the same level of readiness in terms of data collection and disclosure, but 15 out of 18 already responding to these requests from automakers through the CDP platform to say, okay, like, where are you at? Both in terms of what are your emissions, but also what are your plans, what are your goals, what are your exposures, what are your mitigation strategies? I mean, a CDP disclosure sometimes can be, it's got a lot of numbers in it, but it's got a lot of words too. It can be dozens of pages of companies really describing their management practices. And I saw this firsthand when I worked for Dell back in the day, and we got to experience in 2011, when Thailand flooded, and we learned, frankly, that about 80% of the world's hard drives were being produced in a relatively small part of Thailand, and actually quite a few automotive parts as well, and some big automakers, including Honda, had big production facilities there, and all of a sudden that supply chain was completely interrupted because of these floods. And so then you have to ask yourself, so what else is out there that I'm not aware of? And when you look at, 85% of the world's, vanilla beans come from a very small part of southern Madagascar, or, when you look at the production of other key commodities, they're both geographically concentrated. Some of the supply chains are unevenly strong, and like we learned, right, the strength of a network is it's only as strong as its weakest part of the chain, right? And so as we look at things like circularity, for example, what does circular procurement start looking like? How do circular economies create resiliency in or potentially new weaknesses in the chain, and how to address those? So that's our role, is trying to really expose all of that through this relatively simple process of developing detailed questionnaires, collecting a lot of information from a lot of organizations, and then organizing that information for stakeholders, be they lenders, investors, and procurement organizations.
Yep. So Bruno, we're going to pivot back over to AIAG, but one quick comment. Boy, I would love to be a fly on the wall back when you were part of Dell and developing e-commerce strategy 10 years ago. I bet that was a brain trust of talent, and would love to have seen where y'all thought things were going as we've seen, of course, e-commerce emerge at the pace it is now. But Greg, let's talk AIAG.
Yeah, it's interesting because you all are, you're a clearinghouse for data. You're sort of the arbiter of all that's good and right, or should be good and right in terms of environmental management of all sorts of companies. And as you noted earlier in automotive, that we think of a lot of the carbon footprint being downstream when the vehicles hit the street, but in truth, as you said, a large part of it is in the construction, the development and construction of these vehicles, including that there is a lot of carbon footprint in producing things like electric vehicles, right? So it's good that AIAG pulls all of this relatively small environment together, and particularly for this corporate responsibility summit. So give us an idea of what you see as the value of AIAG, but maybe even more particularly the value of this corporate responsibility summit.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. I mean, obviously there's probably not a sector in the world that is not undergoing significant systemic disruptions, and long before coronavirus hit. I mean, we're all, dealing with that too. But the fact is, 3 months ago, I would have said the same thing. There's probably not a sector in the world, food, energy, materials, apparel, automotive, et cetera, that's not, undergoing significant transformation. What's exciting, I think, about AIG and why we're looking forward to being part of it, and as I mentioned earlier, we work a lot and have for years with the world's largest automakers. They've been, really at the forefront of trying to understand, the information that they could collect. But, what's interesting is, the auto sector is and has been a symbol of innovation, ingenuity. It's overcome periods of boom and bust, where competition, globalization continues to produce, new kind of innovative and revolutionary products that continue to inspire and generate excitement about our technological future. And I think this is a time when automotive leaders, must kind of look at this moment in time and seize the moment, consider both how they're impacting the environment, certainly beyond the four walls of their company headquarters, and even, as we mentioned, beyond the downstream emissions their cars produce, cars and trucks, and even as the auto industry is grappling with unprecedented challenges. I mean, it was already trying to figure out this whole future of mobility and these things, and now with everything that we're going through now with this pandemic, and rethinking the idea of the commute, and rethinking the idea of the office, and rethinking the idea of air travel, and rethinking some of these big questions. I think as these challenges continue over the next many weeks, we would look for the auto industry to be bold and to look as we rebuild the economy after this pandemic. We must look to not just kind of go back to what we necessarily were doing, or how can we accelerate the low carbon transition? How can we accelerate a future that is both more exciting for the customers, but also more resilient for the organization, and certainly more friendly to the environment. And really help them think through some of these big questions around the future of the industry in the context of their environmental impacts and their exposure to environmental stresses, and disease is one of those. And we know, for a fact that climate change is a threat multiplier, including with things like the spread of infectious diseases, et cetera. So all these things are kind of connected, but that's what we hope to engage the group with, and then the folks who participate in AIAG, I think, is the tip of the spear for their organization to bring back knowledge, to bring back insights, to bring back best practices, to bring back, opportunities to collaborate on a pre-competitive basis at a sectoral level and even systemic level in the broader kind of transportation space. Our cities, we work a lot with cities, as I mentioned earlier, are super interested in finding new ways to partner with business on, kind of what is the future of the city, what is the future of urban transportation and mobility. So I think all of those things converge, and it's again, another one of those where there's a big wave of disruption on the horizon, whether it's the internet, whether it's climate change, whether it's big societal shift in how they view mobility and transportation and urbanism, and I think it's the automotive sector is at the forefront of helping answer some of these big questions.
Agreed. Driving a lot of the dialogue that is getting people to agree and disagree, and as you stated earlier, we all get better when those tough, frank discussions are taking place. So you just mentioned basically smart cities, and when it comes to smart cities or smart countries, we had a previous guest, and Greg, I can't remember who it was, but they mentioned that Singapore has got to be one of the smartest countries when it comes to Industry 4.0 and interconnectivity and digitization and sustainability, and how all that stuff kind of overlaps. If you had to pick one city that's really getting it right when it comes to forward thinking and forward governance and innovation and what have you, what city comes to mind?
Oh, tough one.
It doesn't have to be the.
Maybe turn it on its head, Bruno. Which is the least offender? City's not known for vision, of course, but who's most pointed the right direction?
I think, if I stick to the U.S. even for now, we've seen obviously some of the big, large cities. I think when you look at the Londons, the New Yorks, the Los Angeles, that years ago actually even kind of came together under this umbrella organization called the C40, really trying to learn from each other and collaborate on some of these big topics. And we do quite a bit of work with the C40 cities. Those cities tend to have things in common, like they have lots of people, they have high density, they have relatively high usage of things like public transit, and but also kind of similar challenges in terms of how do you bring resources for like millions of people into this little part of the world, and so I think there's plenty of leadership happening in those kinds of cities. But then you look at other cities, like you look at cities like St. Louis, Missouri, or Minneapolis, or actually, we work a lot with an organization called the MRCTI, the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, and it's not just the big cities, it's some of the smaller towns up and down the Mississippi River that realize, they all have this river in common, this river ecosystem as a key, not just part of their environment, and when it behaves well, that's great. When it doesn't, it's not so great, whether it's flooding, whether it's, low levels where they can't, have transportation and shipping. Their economy is so connected to the health of that river, but also, how they ultimately all exist in this ecosystem. So part of what, always has me most excited is when I see cities, finding ways to kind of, again, reach out, collaborate, build resilience for their economies and their environments by finding, collaboration across political spectrum, across geographies. You see that in places like maybe, greater Detroit, greater Pittsburgh, greater Minneapolis or Chicago. Again, some of the large anchor cities working collaboratively with some of the smaller cities in their either in their watersheds, sometimes when working on water issues, and even in some states, where some of the state leadership, and right now I'll pick on Florida for a minute. I think Florida is highly exposed to climate risk and extreme weather problems, and you see a lot of great leadership in some of those cities, even if the state, frankly, has been has been kind of on the slow end of really, I think, having an honest conversation about, their future prospects if they don't take serious action. But we've seen a lot of leadership and mayors and counties in Florida, because again, at the end of the day, they know what's coming and they want to do something about it.
Well, it's interesting. Just a quick aside, real estate development in the coastal cities and beaches and whatnot. It's been interesting to see some of the policy decisions. I'm originally from South Carolina, and the Charleston area, the local newspaper has really been questioning the policy making down there when it comes to just how smart and how smart it is for overdevelopment, especially in light of hurricane season and some of the things we've been seeing there. So a lot more conversations to be had for sure. And I'm glad you only picked on Florida for a little bit. So our rankings didn't tank too bad there. So now, kidding aside, Bruno, appreciate your transparency and your thought leadership you shared. Let's make sure, fascinating to see what the model at CDP is and what you do and all that you're involved in. How can our listeners connect with you, and also how can they learn more about CDP?
Yeah, thanks. Well, certainly with me, easiest way to find me is probably on LinkedIn. It's a great platform to connect with folks from all regions and industries. So I think I'm pretty easy to find. Bruno Sarda on LinkedIn. About CDP, we're at cdp.net. We're one of those that's not a .com or a .org or anything. So cdp.net. There's a lot of information there about what we do. If you work in an organization that wants to kind of start on this process again. Whether it's to lead on climate action, start disclosing your impact, maybe start setting some goals, even potentially a science-based goal, all of that, that's where you can either find me or find us, and we'll help you take that next step.
Love that. And Greg, we love our acronyms here in supply chain. I picked up a new one here today, MRCTI, the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. Did I have that right, Bruno?
That's right. Good one.
Pretty strong memory right there.
That's right. Well, kidding aside, really have enjoyed our conversation here with Bruno Sarda, president of CDP North America. Bruno, thanks so much. Looking forward to reconnecting here at the summit, and appreciate what you and your organization do.
All right. Thank you both.
You bet.
Yeah.
Greg, wow. Where to begin? What was one key thought that comes to mind after we wrapped up that interview with Bruno?
We've talked about this a lot, and this is my firm belief that in order to get action, you have to obviate the economic consequence or the economic opportunity to get companies even to do the right thing. Of course, they want to do the right thing, but in truth, the almighty dollar or respective currency rules. So this CDP initiative is the ultimate in identifying that at the most strategic level, right? These companies are 5 to 7% more valuable if they are good actors in terms of environmental awareness, activity, and conservation. So,
great point. The power of aviation.
Say that again?
The power of aviation.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, fascinating. It's tough for all of what Bruno and the CDP team are up to. It's tough to capture as much of it as we can in a 40-minute segment, but we'll have to have him back. But I really enjoyed it. And again, to our audience, you can learn more at cdp.net. So, Greg, that wraps up this interview, one of our last ones related to this CSR Summit that AIAG is putting on. They've made the move, as we both know, to make that free registration for industry professionals. What a great gesture that is.
And in fact, have reduced their carbon footprint by doing it virtually, right?
That's right. That's right. Our listeners can learn more at aiag.org. To our listeners also, be sure to check out the wide array of industry thought leadership at supplychainnowradio.com. Find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. On behalf of Greg White, Scott Luton, the entire team here, we wish you a successful week ahead. Stay safe. Please follow the expert advice and precautions that have been distributed by the wide-ranging expertise from your healthcare professionals. And know this, that brighter days certainly lie ahead. We'll see you next time here on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.